a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Bergen in Norway, whose research centers on characterizing the evolution of deep water and deltaic sedimentary systems in active rift basins. Dr. Cullen earned his PhD from the University of Leeds in the UK, studying exhumed deep water sedimentary systems of the Corinth Rift in Greece as part of the Petromax 2 Sin Rift project, which I believe is where he's calling in today. So he may earn the award for the most scenic location someone's calling in from. As well as continuing his research in the Corinth Rift, he's now focused on deep water Sin Rift systems of the Norwegian continental shelf as part of the Petromax 2 Deep Rift project. Today, he's going to talk about rolling stones and muddy waters, the complexity of processes, deposits, and stratigraphic architecture in short, steep, conglomeratic gravity currents. So Dr. Cullen, take it away.
Thanks very much for the lovely introduction there, Frank, and dealing with the long titles that I tend to make. So yeah, as Frank mentioned, I'm calling in from Greece, so hopefully the internet and my eyelids managed to keep up. We've just been in the field all day, but I'd like to talk to you today about some of the work that we've done in Greece. So I'll just share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see this. Just get pointer.
Looks great.
So yeah, the sort of aim of the talk today is mainly to spark a discussion. I'm not going to give too many answers, mainly because I don't think I quite know them yet. But I'm going to show you around mainly just some exposures at breaks of slopes in very short and steep and conglomeratic systems from the Corinth Rift and some Gilbert deltas, where we have the gorgeous outcrops, a bit like this. And we'll also touch on some trivia and some interesting parallels between the history of blues and rock, my other sort of passion from geology, and some parallels with the turbidite research as well. So this isn't a sort of solo endeavor, and as Frank sort of alluded to, we were part of a really big research group for this. There was myself, and in Leeds there was my supervisors Richard Collier and Dave Hodgson, and leading this overall project was Rob Gawthorpe in Bergen, and then this whole host of other people assisted with various different elements of the work. And it was all sponsored by these companies and the Research Council of Norway and some other grants from the Arthur Meyerhoff grants. And this was all part of the Sin Rift Systems project that you can keep an eye out for. And we're sort of continuing these themes and investigating these a bit more in this Deep Rift Sin Rift project. So keep an eye out for that. There's a whole bunch of PhD students, master students doing some work on things in Greece and in Norway, who are doing some really nice work that it's worth keeping an eye out on. So I think as sedimentologists, there's a lot of deep water outcrop studies. And what I want this one to try and not be is not just another list of fascies that we all run through and everyone falls asleep by the end of the talk, but sort of to see where we've come from in terms of our understanding of gravity flows that are really, really coarse grained and have a very broad range of grain sizes. And sort of this model has been around for quite a while now, one of George Postma's models of looking at very gravelly and conglomeratic gravity currents. And I think broadly people started to split these into sort of two separate things, of something down here that was more like rolling stones and something up in the upper part of those flows that were generally finer grained, sandy and muddy waters, and that they had two very different processes and the two didn't really interact, and that really they were quite different things and that they were a very different beast altogether from the sort of finely grained flows that people looked at. So it's one of the things I want to sort of open up the discussion on later, is sort of how different are these very coarse grained flows, and really look at when and where do they deposit the really coarse grain fraction of them, the really conglomeratic fraction, and what could be controlling that. And we'll sort of try and touch on whether the existing models for sedimentary processes allow interpretation of this, and then challenges that we have in these 1D deposits, either in an applied sense or also just in terms of research, borehole cores, for instance. And seeing how we can relate those processes to architectures and whether we even can at all. So in terms of where we've come from, turbidite sedimentary research started, sort of around the 40s and 50s. People started noticing graded bedding. And at that sort of time, we really treated all sediment mixtures sort of quite similar. There wasn't really a focus on coarse-grained versus fine-grained things. And Coonan and Migliorini did a number of experiments to try and produce these graded beds from turbid clouds. And around about the same time, Muddy Waters was releasing an album called Rolling Stone in the same year. And as that graded and carried on, we sort of started this evolution to the boomer sequence. And we really started to have this model of these gravity currents of producing graded intervals and having various sedimentary structures associated with them. And we still sort of considered fine-grained and coarse-grained systems quite similar. And this was until Walker started considering that actually maybe if we have quite coarse-grained deposits, they behave a little differently. And this was by this time Muddy Waters was well ahead of the game, very popular. And this group called the Rolling Stones played their first gig in the same month even as Boomer published the 1962 volume characterizing the Boomer sequence. And this time, I can say we sort of grouped coarse-grained and fine-grained flows together, apart from in some very edge cases where things were really, really coarse. It wasn't until the 1970s that things started to get really quite different, both in the world of music and also in the world of turbidites. We had the evolution and growth of very widespread turbidite fascies models, and then there was this sort of warm-up piece of work by Walker talking about resedimented conglomerates of turbidite association. And I think it was quite cheeky when he said in terms of little work has been done in 25 years, but it really started to consider that actually maybe we should consider coarse-grained flows very differently from finely-grained flows. And by 1980, this was sort of quite set in stone, very different lifestyles and very different styles of deposits. And the low sequence was sort of what people really considered as what we would expect for very gravelly or conglomeratic gravity currents in the deep water realm. And sort of key importance was this idea that at the base of flows, we had a lot of traction, a lot of very high concentrations and more laminar conditions and the typical turbulent dominated suspension fallout of finer grain flows in the boomer sequence. And we sort of had this idea that they could interact a bit like in Chicago in 1981. But then by the 1990s, we really started to understand this sort of really broad spectrum of gravity current behavior. And that was largely related to concentration, but also clay content. And there was this consideration that turbidity currents can change velocity. They're not always just decelerating. And they also interact with topography. And at the same time, there was huge advances on research in subaerial debris flows, as coarse-grained flows, and how they behave that didn't really make its way into turbidite literature. And this is really where we started to diverge into coarse-grained gravity current models and fine-grained gravity current models, and the two didn't really interact. And I think a lot of this came from, by now we'd had 10 years of characterization of very coarse-grained deposits in oil fields like Bray, where a lot of the work, really good work, was done characterizing very coarse-grained deposits. And the 2000s, with numerical and physical modeling, really saw an acceleration in our understanding. Actually, are turbidity currents the same all the way through? Do they change over time? What happens when they pick up clay? And we had this acceleration in understanding things like transitional flows and hybrid event beds. But a lot of this was focused at the finer end of the grain size spectrum, not really focused toward very coarse grain flows. And that's up until recently when we start revisiting things like Rolling Stones. So there's been a number of papers over the past sort of 10 years that have started to use the techniques available now to characterize coarse-grained gravity current deposits. So this model by Heiss-Henstra has become really popular lately as describing these things with very broad grain size mixtures and how they evolve. And this is sort of running in parallel with real accelerations in what we can do in terms of active monitoring and current structure. And so it feels like a lot of this advances need to make their way into coarse grain gravity current deposits. So the way I'd like to just show the variety of styles of deposits and processes that we can have is from some exposures in the Corinth Rift. And we're going to look through one example here that's of this Pleistocene Gilbert Delta, the Ilias Delta, that's at the western edge of a major rift border fault, the west of the Castro Fault. So this has about 300-meter high faucets that deposit into around about 300-meter high, 300-meter deep water column. And we're going to examine some exposures in the bottom sets, and then also some that are further out from the bottom sets to see how these very gravelly flows behave and how they make their way down dip. So within the bottom sets, right at the bottom of the Gilbert Delta slope, we're going to look at these 4 areas to just look at 4 different expressions of the deposits of very conglomeratic flows. So these are number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we'll just run through them. Broadly, the faucets are sort of dipping to the northeast, and the flows that come out of them from the paleocurrent measurements that we've made on sort of geobody scale, but also on current ripples and things like this, broadly indicates a north and a northeast direction. So this is all sat, as I say, at the edge of that west of the Castro Fault, and something to bear in mind, that major fault is off sort of to the bottom right-hand side of this map here. And generates a very strong structural gradient to the east, and it's that really drives the capture of that deep water fan in the previous map out to the east. So when we look at area 1, this is just a sort of photo panorama from this blue point here, looking at those 4 points again to sort of see where they are. We have this area 1 right at the base of these faucets on the left-hand side that pass out into bottom sets. Area 2 is a little bit further out from that, but within the bottom sets. Also a relatively sub-horizontal bottom set in both of these examples. And area 3 and 4 that are more towards the right-hand side, closer to that west of the Castro Fault. And they have a more slightly shallower dip in the bottom sets than these that go off towards the east. So area 1 is this spectacular exposure, really, the Ilias faucets. Here, they're about 200 meters high in the unit we're going to look at. And the faucets are basically just stacked granular flows, very conglomeratic deposits, dipping around 23 degrees, and then they go to about horizontal for a depositional dip. And it's present day is just back tilted by about 4 or 5 degrees due to some post-depositional uplift. When we look in there, we can divide this units into stratigraphy and check that we're looking at the same stratigraphic packages. And what we're going to do is just focus in on this window here, largely within this unit, which is called WX5. You don't need to worry too much about these for this talk. And this is a digital outcrop model that we produced that allowed us to really have some confidence in correlating things across. And so this faucet is these stacked massive conglomerates, and they're variably supported, but mostly class supported, and they have this very limited sand-rich matrix. So they tend to just look like this. They're quite monotonous to log unless you start getting into drawing pebble clasts and things, and they show very little in the way of imbrication. You occasionally see some inverse grading, but for the most part, they're generally massive and quite chaotic internally. And even within that faucet at the base of this Gilbert Delta, once we start to move basinward, we start to move into these pebbly sandstones that sit within these scours. So these are multiple scour surfaces here. There's a hammer for scale, and you see this much less clast-rich sort of texture to them. The matrix is quite gravelly. It's gravelly to sort of medium sand, and they can produce this really strong backstepping fabric into scours. And they're commonly associated with these more heterolithic and silt-prone intervals, and you can also start to get these very open framework lenses within there. So some close-up examples of this, those pebbly sandstones that have some of these layers that have virtually no clasts within them, and some really, really outsized sort of cobble clasts. And these sorts of thinner matrix-supported gravelly horizons that are quite common within this transition from the faucet to bottom set. And as you pass out into the bottom set with these 2 yellow arrows here, being the picture on the left and the right, you have that continuing theme then of these thin gravel-rich horizons that contain very outsized pebble clasts, and those expand outwards down dip to these sort of 40 centimeter thick class supported conglomerates, and these quite commonly show inverse grading, and they can show really nice imbrication at the top. So some nice examples here, and also lower down they can have this very low angle fabric to the bed as well. But these are separated by typically planar laminated to cross rippled very fine sandstones and siltstones, either as sequences of multiple little turbidites or as entire fining up sequences on the order of sort of 5 to 20 centimeters thick, equal thicknesses. And these bed forms have this broadly convex form over here, but they sort of pinch and well and stack on top of one another. So this is a sort of strike section through them, and you can see that they slightly thin over to the edge, and they form these sort of amalgamated beds in parts, depending on how they stack laterally. But their sort of minimum width is about 50 meters, and they sort of get up to about 3 meters as a maximum. They're quite lensoid. So up dip, they have this quite weak imbrication to them, and they are more occasionally developed on bed tops than the lower part, but that imbrication becomes stronger and stronger down dip. They typically have no grading, or they have this inverse to normal grading, and sometimes just this inverse grading in the lower to middle parts. And they become increasingly class supported down dip. Sometimes they're amalgamated onto other conglomerate beds distally. We interpret these as these sort of pebbly bar forms at the base of the foreset, as a product of these very polydisperse, really broad grain size range gravity currents. And so you have that really pebbly lower part of a flow is deposited as this, these sorts of gravelly bars, and then a later, more sand-rich part of the flow is what is making that intervening parts. So deposition from these thick, fast-moving flows that have these sort of collisional or frictional debris flow characteristics in the lower part. Could also describe them as hyperconcentrated flows, I think. And they sort of decelerate at a sort of reasonable or moderate pace, but they manage to run out for distances of several hundred meters. And the reason why I say they can decelerate quite a bit is they're developing this fabric internally, they're developing imbrication. They're not just instantly collapsing and freezing at the base of the foreset. So that's area 1 with those high aspect sort of pebbly bars. And as we move on to area 2, we start to look into these things which are called cubs, which is a term that's unfamiliar to most, that we use in some of these exposures in Greece. So I'm just going to show a short drone video to sort of help demonstrate this. So that's where we were up before, bottom of the Gulf Delta. And as we turn a little further down dip, we fly into this stratigraphy, and we can see these 2 darker coloured blobs of conglomerates. And these are about 10 to 20 meters high and about 150 meters wide. So there's a higher one up here and a lower one down here, and we'll talk about these 2 different styles as we fly in, and they just tend to sit within more heterolithic stratigraphy, a little bit like what we were looking at in area 1. And as we move in on this drone image, you can start to see that these are bedded internally, and they sort of radiate out towards the edges, where they can actually then become quite massive and amalgamated in this example. So this is the lower style. It has this very chaotic internal axial parts, really fluidized, lots of soft sediment deformation, lots of really big boulder-sized clay intraclasts that then pass out into these sort of wing-like radial stratified portions on the right-hand side. And then something that has quite a very different character is this upper cub. So we now fly towards this with this drone video. Now we can speed this up a little bit, and we can see that this is much more cross-stratified. These are foresets that are within there that are of the order of 10 to 20 meters high, and that stratification is happening more at meter scales rather than several meter scales as it was in that lower cub. So there's an example log through that lower cub here, and just in terms of what the bed scale architecture is like. There's very little in the way of grading. They're quite massive, variably supported, both vertically and laterally. But where there is matrix, it tends to be very gravelly and very, very coarse sand. This is an example of some of those massive parts at the edge. So you can see these are sorts of one amalgamated bed, whether they were multiple events, and these are some of those boulder-sized intraclasts. And so this is that lower style. It's internally chaotic in central part with this wing geometry into these really chaotic lateral parts of these convex up bodies or cubs. And then there's that second style that's something's missing there, has this cross stratification internally. So they both pinch out distally from the delta about 1 kilometer. So these are quite restricted to this really proximal part of the foreset. And we have some interpretations flying around on these, and given the sort of really chaotic nature of this axial part of the lower one, we interpret this as quite a chaotic failure of the foreset. It brings with it a lot of mud that is perhaps sat on the foreset at the time of deposition, and it manages to make this really cohesive debris flow in the middle that then has these more frictional or granular flows that pass off to the right and the left-hand side of that axis. And that contrasts to this style up here, where we probably have multiple failures of the foreset or multiple flows from the river up dip. And these deposit more as these frictional or collisional, some people call them cohesionless, debris flows that manage to stack and build topography at the bottom of the Gilbert Delta slope. So that's area 2. We'll now move on to area 3 as we start to move towards that stronger structural gradient from the west of the Castro Fault. So this is a lovely example of an exposure called the Helidori exposure. And we built a digital outcrop model of this as well and managed to interpret a number of these major surfaces that mark these sort of broad but wing-shaped scour forms. So we're looking down flow here, and we can start to pick apart some of these different surfaces. And what is instantly apparent is that they're quite amalgamated, but they also tend to host these thicker, really thick conglomerate beds. So these, don't need to worry too much about these numbers, but these darker colors represent more conglomeratic units, and these paler colors represent more sand or heterolithic units, these blues being mud-rich slumps. And what we get behind this exposure is a dip section of this, and we can start to see how these scour forms look as we carry on distally into the basin. It's long been thought for this exposure that this was part of a series of channels at the base of slope that were really exporting into the basin. But when we look in dip section, we actually see that these scour forms start to dip back up towards the base of slope. And they're typically filled with this package of a very conglomeratic layer that's then goes through some more heterolithic stratigraphy. And we'll take a closer look at an example in here to just show one of those packages that's really quite spectacular. So they have this scour surface through here. This is one of the major scour surfaces that we were able to correlate through to that other side. And that's typically overlain by either a class-supported massive conglomerates, or these can actually also be quite muddy, as they are in this example here, as quite a cohesive debrite. And then that passes into more heterolithic stratigraphy that in this example actually has some spectacular supercritical bed forms. So you can see there's this sort of shearing of the substrate underneath, and then we have these bed forms that step back up the slope. And that's then overlain by this alternating conglomerates and siltstone packages, a bit like we saw in area 1. And this packaging is sort of typically in the order of about 6 meters or 6 to 10 meters, and repeats and back steps up these scour surfaces. So there's some labels there just to show these individual parts that we just discussed. And those cyclic steps themselves, when we look at another example lower down, we can actually start to see that they themselves are really complicated and really heterolithic. They're not just all fine-grained muds. This is an example that shows something that's really quite gravelly. We have this backstepping fabric through here. And then these are sort of marked by the conglomerates only really happening in the relative lows or as these highs, which make topography. And then the more mud prone, but still quite poorly sorted, carrying individual pebbles, are the things that really stack back and make the bed forms. So there's just an interpretation there that highlights some of these conglomerates and how variable they are laterally, how quickly they change laterally within these sort of 8-meter distances. So this is our model for that sort of base of slope chute, which we now call them, where we have an initial erosive phase that preserves a very thin gravel that expands outwards into those sort of tabular conglomerates that you saw in the first part of the figure. And that gradually overfills, really, and then, which is in that first figure, we saw some of these step on the wings, a bit like this. So this is how we explain that sort of overfilling of the scour topography. And then above that, we have the development of more heterolithic cyclic steps and bed forms that are associated with later parts of the flow. And they either re-size or they really overfill from further flows that don't do much erosion, but do a lot of deposition. So we call these base slope chutes, and they're quite laterally limited, and they produce these lobes that are quite fan and fin-like as we look at them down into stratigraphy. So the bypass is a little bit more complicated here. We have those thin gravels that thicken out into conglomerates. During this time, the sand that's associated with those conglomerates is bypassing basinwards, and it's quite separate from the gravel part of the flow. Those conglomerates are depositing either as sort of low cohesion or frictionless debris, friction collisional debris flows, or as very thin lags within those supercritical bed forms. And these sort of crude geometries to the fans show that we're having a really sort of different style of the really gravelly deposits at the base of slope. And if we move towards area 4, this is just an outcrop model to sort of set the scene. For this, we have this major surface that separates what becomes quite a large channel that goes down into the deeper basin floor. So this next slide that we're going to show is this blue line that shows a section through that channel. That's really quite spectacular. You get some really nice exposures of channel lags and how they interact with substrates. And so this is a log that goes through that and shows generally more conglomerate dominated lower parts that then becomes increasingly dominated by more typical low style gravelly turbidites. And there's a number of major scour surfaces, but they tend to be lined by quite different things. So it's not necessarily like the base of slope chutes that we just saw that have this quite repetitive packaging. The scours can be reflecting a sort of broader evolution of this channel form. And the base of it is something that's really quite interesting in terms of its conglomeratic flows. So we see this very variable character over sort of 10 meters. And the most striking thing, I think, is this sort of 2-meter package of class-supported conglomerates that show this internal down-dip stratification, almost building bars within the channel. And that's entirely contrasted from this matrix-supported, much coarser grained, very poorly sorted, cobble-grade conglomerate. And the matrix in here has everything from mud through to gravel. So it's a much more chaotic deposit in there. But this basal part is actually quite flat. And we can get a really nice sense of how the flow that was ahead of this debris was eroding the substrates here. And it's picking up these enormous rafts from the side of the channel and the substrate. And you have this very complex relationship with this later part of the flow, where it appears as though the picking up of these rafts has introduced just enough clay into the flow to be able to freeze the whole thing, and then this stacks up behind it. That's our sort of process interpretation for this basal part of the flow. And you can see that it's really messy where we're picking up these rafts. We've got a really broad grain size range, and that manages to just seemingly stop and freeze the flow whilst it's picking up and rafting some of these blocks. But that varies even over that sort of 20-meter section. So you can just imagine if you had a log or core through any number of these spots, you actually have quite a different character and presumably then a different interpretation of what this might be. We think back to some of those class-supported conglomerates that we saw in Area 1, and in a log form, that might look something like this. And it's only until you really see this good evidence of picking up and rafting up these blocks that you might start to interpret this as a major channel feature in a 1D section. So the implications are that you have some very different architectures with deposits that could look quite similar in a 1D intersection. And they're also just changing spatially over a distance of about 3 kilometers, quite substantially in terms of the architecture of the original deposits, but also in terms of the flow processes that have to form them, the amount of bypass of things like sand, and also the overall geometry that they produce. And one of the things that's really helped with our understanding of this distribution is looking at bathymetry of modern deltas. And there's been 2 studies in particular from the deltas in British Columbia that have been really helpful for this. And so we can start to tie in our outcrop observations to where and why these might be occurring in modern systems. So this, what we saw in Area 1 of these sort of gravelly bars or pebbly bars, they sort of have a similar scale and a similar relationship with the foresets as some of these lobes that were pointed out in Gales et al. 2019. And Area 2 has much more of a relationship with these sort of debris lobes, really high, but with a very central chaotic portion that then dipped radially away from that axial portion. And Area 3, as we sort of alluded to earlier, is a bit more like these chutes at the base of slope that are responsible for some more limited bypass of sand grade sediments. And this should say Area 4 here, but these are much more evolved features, more like the sort of nick point filled channels off the front of the Squamish Delta in Vendatrolli. And when we look at this in context of the Ilias system, we actually see that this has a relationship with the angularity of the foreset to bottom set transition. So in Area 1 and 2, we're basically coming down a fairly steep foreset onto a relatively sub-horizontal bottom set. There is some topography that's made by those features that affect the later deposits. But broadly, we're out onto this quite open ramp at the tip of this fault. As we move closer towards the structural gradient of the major fault that's off to the right-hand side here, we start to see much more in the way of bypass, much longer forms of conglomerates, and much more erosion at the base of slope. So there's been some work on this beforehand in quite sand-rich systems, and thinking about where we can have up-dip pinch outs and things like this. But in these gravelly systems, we see that this has a much more marked effect on the conglomeratic portion. And we think that's probably something to do with momentum and how these flows transform down dip. So imagine back to that Heiss-Henstra model that showed that as you get to that base of slope, you chaotically drop most of your coarse grain sediment. We sort of see that here, but we see that it depends a lot on this angle of the bottom set. And we think that's to do with the more dense lower part of that flow actually on very steep slopes is able to move to the front of the flow, largely because of its momentum. It's not entraining as much water. It's not having things dampened that driving its movements, unlike the sandier parts of the flow where water entrainment and this fast movement is able to actually lose the sediment concentration that's driving it down slope. Whereas these more laminar parts of the flow are able to really accelerate on that slope. Or this sort of segregation of grain size can be predetermined, and there's some spectacular videos recently, but also lots of work done at the USGS Flume on subaerial flows that show that the heads of really broad grain size mixtures tend to be dominated by the coarsest grains. So the boulders, the cobbles, the pebbles that we see here are all sort of at the front of the flow. And if you see these videos of flash floods that enter the sea, you sort of see the first thing that comes is this really bouldery, debris-laden, clast-rich head of the flow. And as that enters the sort of marine realm, we suspect that that part is the thing that really accelerates down the slope. And then this is having a lot of momentum that allows it to carry out and build these sorts of depositional forms. So that's just some examples from the variety really that we can get in that proximal part of the system, right at the toe of the foreset. But then we're just going to take a quick look through what happens as we move on further down dip, because we've spoken a lot about how we dump conglomeratic sediment here, and we might expect, okay, well, further on into this system, we don't really have any more conglomerates, and we don't need to worry too much about having big conglomeratic lobes, and most of this system should be sandy beyond here. But as you can probably guess by the tone, that's not really what sort of happens. So this is a section along this face here. We're going to be looking from this direction along a transect that follows an intrabasinal fault. So there's an intrabasinal fault here that dips in this direction, a normal fault that produces a ramp in topography that comes down into the basin floor. That ramp is this 14 degrees dip over here at the moment, and that passes out into this horizontal stratigraphy over here. And in these units, what we see is actually quite heterolithic stratigraphy. It's quite sandy and silty, and just sort of ordinary turbidites, but there are these thin layers all the way across there, these thin gravelly horizons like this. And so a bit like we saw at Olive Grove with those things that expand out in area 1, that expand out into those pebbly bars, we see these very poorly sorted gravelly matrix holding pebbles and things like that, layers all over this ramp on this slope. And as we move down dip, we start to see much more in the way of erosive features than the more tabular architecture up here. We also see those sort of interfingering with slump deposits, and they tend to be filled, at least in this example, by more sand or silt-prone stratigraphy. And it's not until we get really to the basin floor where then we start to see conglomerates. So this is an example from a digital outcrop model in that left-hand side of that transect before, and we see these really chaotic 1 to 2 meter scale megabeds of conglomerates. You can have very variable grain size trends, and they change their character from sort of fairly organized to entirely disorganized and disaggregated quite a lot laterally. And they stack to make these laterally extensive conglomeratic sheets. So these blue and dark brown colors in here are these really thick debrites, and their character can change dramatically a lot along their length. They have these quite debritic and chaotic sections, and then sometimes they can just develop really well organized cross stratification. And we interpret these as being similar to some of the subaerial debris flow experiments that are done, where they have central chaotic sections that then have levees on the side of them, and this cross stratification is representing those levees. And these are quite similar to some of the megabeds described in, for instance, the Bray play in the northern North Sea, but also in the Cerretora Formation, of these really high volume, really highly concentrated flows. And so the question is, how is this making its way 8 or 9 kilometers out into the basin from the Gilbert Delta, when we saw how much conglomerate we were managing to store up in the bottom sets? And we think that this ramp really plays a very strong role in being able to accelerate flows that have conglomerate grade material in them down into the basin floor. Whereas, again, sort of on that slope, the more sand-rich or muddy parts of the flow are constantly being diluted, and that's why we tend to see such a sand-rich ramp, with those very thin gravels being the only suggestion that we have the bypass of this sort of material. And then it's not until they reach the basin floor and go against a confining slope that these conglomerates start to deposit in this very chaotic sheets. Whether these are directly linked to very large events that come out of the delta, we can't really be entirely sure. There's nothing diagnostic in those, because they could equally just be earthquakes or seismic events that trigger remobilization of these things up here. But they all get captured within this intrabasinal low as these conglomeratic pods that are basically detached from anything up here. And this is sort of an amplification of what we know at the finer grained end of the scale and systems. So there's some really nice models presented in Bakker et al. That show that debris flows, cohesive ones, tend to be much more strongly bottom hugging than the finer grained turbulent flows, flows. And this is really an amplification of that. And so we're seeing that coarse grained debris are behaving, at least in their response to topography, relatively similarly to the finer grained, more cohesive debrites in this example. And so in terms of why we should care about this, there's obvious sort of applied reasons related to things like reservoir architecture and things, but there's also some really interesting historical data that shows why these are really important in the Gulf of Corinth, especially. So you get these enormous storms in the Gulf of Corinth, and these cause a lot of problems for infrastructure on the coast, but also in the subsea. And this is a map from Heesen et al. In 1960, where all the historical records of cable breaks for the original telecommunications cables were put together and recorded in terms of their seasonality. And they saw this huge problem that every winter all the cables were getting broken. And this is an example of what happened in a recent Medicane. The entire harbour in the town of Zelicastro was destroyed. These sorts of events, and they produce huge sediment plumes, but beneath that, of course, we have these very coarse grained flows making their way into the deep water. And there's some reports that suggest just quite how problematic these were, of alluvium coinciding with a bad gale, which breaks, chafes, and gives rupture to these cables by the stress of alluvium deposits that included roots and branches of shrubs, and as a result of things happening on the deltas, in the modern deltas. And these sort of storms and things led to a lot of these cables being moved slightly basinward, but you see that all of these dots are still producing cable breaks within this range that we're finding the conglomeratic deposits in the Elias system. So sort of lesson, I guess, is that we need to consider these sorts of distances that we see in outcrops of where these flows are able to get to in terms of positioning things like subsea infrastructure and understanding the pinch out really these conglomeratic flows. So as I said, I wouldn't really provide answers. There are some sort of things that are really nice to discuss just on the basis of that whole variety that we saw that we still struggle to explain. And there's a real need to sort of get our understanding of conglomeratic gravity currents up to speed with those in the finer grained realm, and understand what triggers and controls this segregation of grain sizes downslope, because we believe that that's really important for the differences in the architectures that we see, particularly at the base of the foresets. And what are the implications of that segregation on bypass of sediments of different grade? And one thing that I didn't touch too much on in there was that we see this slight difference of matrix versus class support, but the vast majority of those deposits have really variable class support. We didn't really see these really obviously matrix supported things other than right in the transition and things chaotically dropping at the base of slope. The vast majority of the deposits are actually class supported. And so there's a lot to be learned, I think, from these subaerial debris flows and how they respond to topography, and seeing how that can be translated into the marine realm. And we saw that actually a lot of those different architectures have remarkably similar lithofabrics or facies. And so it suggests that the facies themselves aren't necessarily unique to sub-environments, and you need to have the context of either broader stratigraphy or something in the mapping that can tell you where you are and what type of form you're building. And in that sense, coming up with facies models is always going to be a bit of a nightmare. There is a lot of variety in these deposits. And so it's quite difficult to come up with something that's holistic and manages to describe all that variability and still be relatively simple to use. And we've seen that the sort of modern surveying of active systems and also the monitoring that's helped understand all the momentum in finer grain flows is really helping us understand these strange architectures that we're seeing in these very coarse grain systems. So with that, I'll sort of finish up, and if anyone has any questions, it'd be really nice to hear them.
All right, well, thank you, Tim. Folks can again write any questions you have in the chat while we wait for those to roll in. I'll start off by asking a rock properties question. So in my world, I deal a lot with porosity and permeability, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether this broad grain size mixtures that you see in these deposits would lead to these deposits having internal baffles to fluid flow. How porous are the deposits or different facies? Or would these essentially act as one giant reservoir if they were in the subsurface?
In terms of translation to the subsurface, I think the main sort of bugbear, if you like, is the cementation. You have such massive and variable porosities in some of these things, especially those open framework and really class supported conglomerates, that at least in the examples I've seen in the subsurface, you tend to just find that they're quite easily cemented. But in some of the examples where things are matrix supported, the matrix is really well sorted. And it's a little bit unclear how you get that well sorted matrix in such a deposit that's overall quite poorly sorted. And I think it's sort of the real problem is thinking of things being basically too connected. And in terms of baffles, it's relying really on understanding cementation and basically the provenance of those class. So, for example, the example we have here is there's a lot of limestone hinterland in the Gulf of Corinth. So these things are really full of limestone clasts. And so with a bit of burial and a bit of water running through them, I'd imagine they'd be full of calcite cement.
Okay, that's interesting. We have a question here from Howard Feldman. Hi, Howard. How do you define debris flow? Does it need to be cohesive?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion in terms of this spectrum of deposits that I mentioned earlier on, and I think the long-standing view has been that debris flows have to have cohesion. They have to have some sort of yield strength that has to be overcome to be either moved or go the other way to be deposited. But I think what we're seeing here is that you have such high concentrations, presumably, in these things, and just the way that those class supported things are really packed, that at the basal part of those flows, I suspect that they are behaving in a sort of frictional way, and they are just packed so tightly that that layer moves in a laminar way. So my feeling is that you don't necessarily need cohesion to call things a debris flow, and that, you know, we look at these subaerial debris flows. People happily call those debris flows without seeing a lot of mud in them, because of the grain size and the breadth of the grain size that they carry. But what that needs then is some more explanation of the physics of how do these things deposit if we're not accounting for cohesion as being the thing that drives that. And I think that's the sort of next step in understanding what really goes on at the base of these flows in these more laminar parts.
Interesting, interesting. I have another question here. So in your new position in Norway, I assume you're moving into the subsurface with some of your observations. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how your outcrop observations have informed your interpretations of subsurface data like well logs or seismic through similar types of deposits.
I think the stuff in Greece has given us a really sort of nicer understanding of the variety of architectures that these flows can apply to. So seeing a lot of these pebbly sandstones, for instance, doesn't necessarily tell you the type of environment that you're in. There are a few things that are diagnostic, and But it's a lot more about the context of things that are in. So I spoke about how some of those fascias aren't necessarily unique to certain environments. And I think that becomes really important when you're interpreting core, for example. There's a lot of places where you can come up then with 2 or 3 different types of elements or different types of geomorphological settings that you're in on the basis of the deposits that you're looking at. But I mean, the outcrops really have just given us a really nice idea of what types of architectures are there. So the things like the cubs, these debris lobes, I think we'd always probably struggle to interpret those in the subsurface without having this idea of how they look in the outcrop and what they could possibly be. So yeah, it's a real challenge, obviously, to do these interpretations on cores. As I show that like variety with that channel, for instance, is the sort of thing where the outcrops can help when we consider these different models. When it comes to seismic geomorphology and things, we're starting to really understand the sediment routing a little bit better, I think, and understanding that just because there's quite a bit of conglomerate in a section doesn't necessarily mean we're right at the bottom of a Gilbert Delta or the inner Gilbert Delta. And that in these very coarse grain systems, there are ways to get conglomerate grade material quite far out into the basin.
Fascinating. Thank you. It's again, it's always exciting to me to talk about how we can apply our outcrop learning into these other data sets that we collect at different scales for different reasons. So thanks. We have a question from Valentin. Hey, Tim, amazing talk. And that intro was smooth. Loved it. I guess my question goes as follows. Is there anything special, in quotes, needed for rift systems to generate so much conglomerate? As in, do you always generate so much conglomerate in a rift basin? Or is there something special about the area around the Gulf of Corinth that allows for the generation of so much conglomeratic material? Again, Valentin from Aachen, Germany.
That's a great question, Valentin. And I think in that sense, the Corinth Rift is quite unique, and some of the other coarser grain systems in the world are as well. But the thing that really drives it here is the shortness and the steepness of the catchments that things are coming from. So, for instance, in the Ilias Delta, the catchment that was feeding that was only about maybe 20 to 25 kilometers long up dip from Ilias, but it had an elevation difference of about 2 kilometers. So you have these very short, very steep systems that do a lot of geomorphic work, especially in the climates that are typical of the Mediterranean, where they're sort of very prone to these very flashy events. And that's quite different when we compare it to, for instance, systems in the North Eigengraben or in the North Sea, which are typically more sandy. The deltas there are quite different, and that has implications for understanding how we can take outcrop observations into the subsurface from here. For instance, thinking of what you store in the delta, you store huge amounts of conglomerate, and there's still some making it out. So this is the idea that we need to get better at sort of predicting conglomerate bypass, I think, and understanding when conglomerate makes its way further out into the system. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, the Corinth Rift is probably a bit of an anomaly in quite how conglomeratic these things are. So yeah.
Excellent. We have another question here. Rebecca Englert from Calgary, Canada says, thanks for a very interesting talk. Are there any active modern deep water systems aside from deltas where conglomeratic gravity currents such as those you describe occur? More of a direct modern analog to the Cerro Toro formation ?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know of any active non-Gilbert Delta systems. I mean, there's some parts of the Corinth Rift that just have sort of these little fault scarp aprons, but what we don't really know yet is quite how active they are. And so there's a guy in Leeds, Mohammed, who's working on some bathymetric data and some seismic data from those fans in the Corinth Rift at the moment. So hopefully we sort of get to understand that a bit better. the Corinth Rift has sort of a number of active deltas at one end and then some more sediment starved parts on the other end. But there are these fans there that it would be interesting to see whether this sort of point sourced, very coarse grained system is any different. But other than that, yeah, I can't think of any modern active ones now.
All right, any additional questions out there? If not, oh, Valentin has a follow-up. Can we therefore expect coarse systems along active margins? Can we expect coarse systems along active margins where catchments tend to be short and steep?
I think as a general model, that's probably a reasonable rule to follow. Just because of the ability for processes in the catchment to liberate really coarse-grained sediments. I guess there's also a sort of hinterland provenance type element to that story. You compare, for instance, the hinterland here is all Mesozoic carbonates, but also metamorphic phyllites and things like this. Compare that to a more micaceous or a more harder wearing as well provenance, like you get, for instance, in the North Vikengraben around Butsira, from these more granitic hinterlands. Then you also start to see quite a difference in the character of the deltas there, even in similarly short catchments. So there's shortness and steepness is a nice rule, I think, and I think that's a good sort of first order thing to build your understanding of how much conglomerate there's going to be in your system. And then the sort of next thing to build that upon is, well, what is the actual provenance? What am I eroding? So here it's able to do some quite substantial erosive work because it's steep, but also because the hinterland is these Mesozoic carbonates that are quite young, but also able to be reworked quite quickly and easily.
So what you're saying is if it is granite, it's harder to erode. And so you get, how does that relate to the conglomerate that you get down dip? Is there just less of it, or is it different character some way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a specialist in provenance analysis, but the sort of suggestions we see when we compare stuff in the North Sea, for example, to the Corinth Rift is that generally there's a lot less conglomerate in that system. But we can compare that to, for instance, things where there's sort of second cycle reworking of things. So in some of the Norwegian Sea examples, start to see increased amounts of conglomerate, partly because there's very short, steep systems, but also what they're eroding already has conglomeratic material in it. And there's quite a bit of that in the Corinth Rift as well, actually. Some of the early rift material is very conglomeratic, and you manage to rework that into your later stage conglomerates as well.
Right. Well, thanks. This has been a fascinating presentation on behalf of everyone that has been in attendance. We really thank you for taking time out of your field campaign that you have going there, your field trip, to call in and share your science with us, because it really advances our community to see what novel, interesting things are going on out there in the world. So thank you again on behalf of SEDS Online and the International Association of Sedimentologists. We'll call this presentation to an end, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks.